A billionaire spent 8 years and millions of dollars trying to cure his daughter's deafness. Every specialist said it was impossible. Then a maid with zero medical training did something that would expose the darkest secret in modern medicine. And what she discovered will make you question everything you thought you knew about the healthcare system. This is a true story that changes everything. Before we dive in, hit the like and subscribe button. The truth coming up will leave you speechless. Evan Richmond had everything: a billion-dollar empire, power, influence, the kind of wealth that could move mountains. But there was one thing he couldn't buy. Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, was born deaf. And despite every effort he could make, every doctor he could afford, every treatment he could find, he couldn't make her hear a single word. The best specialists, the finest medical minds. Evan's wealth allowed him to bring them all in. Experts from Switzerland, Germany, Japan, and the United States, people who were supposedly at the cutting edge of medicine. He didn't spare a penny. Not a single one. He was determined to do whatever it took. But each time they all said the same thing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richmond. There's nothing we can do." The words reverberated in his mind like a curse. Nothing we can do. The phrase had become a mantra, repeated over and over, until it was no longer just something the doctors said to him. It became his own reality, and every time it sank deeper into him. His daughter, his only remaining connection to his late wife, Ava, would never hear. Ava, her mother, had died during childbirth. That was a wound Evan would never recover from. He couldn't. She was his soulmate, his everything, and she was gone in an instant. He was left with this tiny piece of her, Sophie. But Sophie would never heard Mother's voice. And now it seemed like she would never hear his either. Can you imagine? Being a father, wanting to tell your daughter you love her, and knowing that no matter how much you try, no matter how much you spend, she'll never hear those words. Evan thought about it every day, and at night he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing that there was something, anything he could do. But it was all beyond him. The medical system had failed him, failed Sophie. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had everything, except the one thing that mattered most. And the mansion, the home he had built, designed to be a place of life, of warmth, had become a tomb of silence. The halls, once meant to be filled with laughter and joy, were now empty, quiet, lonely. Even with all the wealth in the world, he couldn't fill the void that was Sophie's world. It was just him, his guilt, and a silent daughter who would never hear a word of comfort from her father. Sophie's world was still. Each day felt like a slow march through the same routine. He'd walk into her room, and there she was, staring out of the window, her eyes wide with curiosity, but there was always a distance between them, a silence that no amount of money or specialists could bridge. She could see the world. She could watch everything happening around her. But she could never hear it. Evan had tried to fill that silence with anything he could. He hired the best tutors, enrolled Sophie in every program he could find, and still nothing changed. He brought in the best neurologists, tried experimental treatments, and even funded clinical trials, anything that promised a breakthrough. But nothing. He spent millions of dollars chasing something that never came. His bank account drained, his hopes slowly faded with each failed attempt. But there was nothing worse than the deep, gnawing guilt that tore at him every time he saw Sophie struggle. He couldn't fix it. The day Sophie was born was meant to be the happiest day of his life. Ava, his wife, had been the love of his life. Their dream was to have a family, to grow old together and share everything they had built. But that dream was shattered in an instant. Ava died during childbirth, and Evan was left alone. And even though Sophie was a living reminder of his wife, his only piece of her, he couldn't help but feel that life had taken something from him too cruelly. Sophie's condition, her deafness, was a constant reminder of how fragile life really was. Evan hadn't been able to bring Sophie's mother back, and now he couldn't bring her voice back either. The nights were the worst. The silence was unbearable. Evan couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. His mind was consumed by what-ifs. He had failed Sophie. He had failed Ava. He was a billionaire, a man who could move mountains. But there was nothing he could do to change the reality that Sophie would never hear. He had it all, except the one thing he wanted most: to hear Sophie's voice. That's when the guilt became too much to bear. But what Evan didn't know, as he sat in the darkness of his thoughts, was that everything was about to change. It wouldn't come from a doctor. It wouldn't come from some expert he had flown across the world to consult. It wouldn't come from any of the millions he had spent, no. It would come from the most unlikely person he could imagine. 3 weeks ago, a new maid was hired. Her name was Anna Watts. She was 27 years old, no college degree, no medical training, just a woman trying to make ends meet. She was quiet, reserved. When she walked into the mansion for the first time, the staff barely noticed her. Why would they? She wasn't a part of the elite circle. She wasn't someone of importance. She was just the help. She scrubbed the floors, cleaned the windows, and did everything she was told without a word of complaint. She was exactly what they expected, a cog in the mansion's sprawling, polished machine. But while the others kept their heads down, Anna noticed everything. She noticed the way Evan Richmond, the billionaire, walked through the halls in silence, his face tight with some unspoken grief. She noticed the small details, the fading curtains, the dust collecting in forgotten corners, the grand piano in the corner that had never been touched. But more than anything, she noticed Sophie. Sophie was different from the other children Anna had worked around in the past. She was quiet, yes, but there was more to it. There was an emptiness in her world, an invisible barrier that Anna could feel when she watched her. On her third day, as Anna was cleaning the library, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Sophie, the 8-year-old girl who had lived in the silence of her own world for as long as Anna had known, was sitting by the window, playing with a small puzzle. Suddenly, her tiny hand reached up to her ear. Anna's breath caught in her throat as Sophie winced. Her hand lingered, rubbing at her ear, and then she winced again. A flash of pain crossed her face, a sharp, silent moment that told Anna everything she needed to know. The room around Sophie was peaceful. The sunlight streamed through the glass, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound. But Sophie's eyes were clouded with something deeper. She wasn't playing anymore. She was holding back tears. Anna's feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She stood there, watching. The other staff members, walking in and out of the library, didn't notice. They never did. Sophie's little gestures, her constant self-soothing movements, had become invisible to them. They had seen it 100 times before and had dismissed it every time. It was just part of who Sophie was, a deaf child. But to Anna, it wasn't nothing. To her, it was everything. Anna's cousin Emily had gone through something strikingly similar some years back. Emily was about Sophie's age, just a child, full of life, but something was wrong. Doctors had told her parents over and over again that Emily had a learning disability, that her behavioral problems were a result of something deeper. They treated it like a mental issue, something that needed therapy, not treatment. Anna watched her cousin struggle for 2 years. She saw Emily's frustration, her loneliness, and the pain in her eyes when she couldn't understand what was wrong with her. But there was something Anna's family didn't know. It wasn't until her grandmother, a woman with only a 6th grade education, noticed something small yet significant. Emily always tilted her head to one side. Anna's grandmother was old and didn't have much formal schooling, but she had observed. One day, after years of watching Emily struggle, Grandma took her to a walk-in clinic. The doctor there didn't just check Emily's behavior. He looked inside her ears. He found a massive ear infection, something that had gone completely undetected by every single doctor who had examined her. It was a simple blockage, a small, solvable problem that had been missed. Within weeks, Emily was a different child. The constant frustration, the confusion, the anger, all disappeared. She could hear, she could learn, she could play like any other child. And now Anna couldn't shake that memory. She kept watching Sophie, closely, carefully, every time Sophie rubbed her ear or winced in pain. It was so similar to what Emily had gone through. The same instinct, the same tiny but crucial signs that no one had noticed. Anna couldn't ignore it anymore. It was right there in front of her. Sophie wasn't just deaf. Something was physically wrong, something that had been overlooked for so long. Now Anna had two choices. She could mind her business, stay out of it. She was just a maid after all. What did she know about medical problems? She was only there to clean, to do her job, and stay quiet. She could easily walk away, pretend she hadn't seen anything, and go back to her routine. No one would notice. But that nagging feeling deep inside her wouldn't let her go. She couldn't just ignore it. Not when she remembered Emily. Not when she remembered the pain of watching someone struggle because no one was paying attention. She couldn't let that happen again. Not to Sophie. The other choice was much harder. It could cost her everything. She could act. She could step forward and say something, do something. She could try to help Sophie, even if it meant risking her job. It might even mean legal consequences. What if she was wrong? What if someone found out she had no medical training and called it medical malpractice? But what if she was right? What if, by simply taking the time to look, to care, to do something no one else had, she could give Sophie something she had never had before? A chance to hear the world. A chance to experience everything that had been denied to her for so long. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. The house was still. Quiet. Too quiet. The mansion that usually felt so alive, bustling with servants and business, was now a hollow shell of echoes. But Anna wasn't bothered by the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound that kept her awake. It was the constant loop running in her head. Sophie's pain, Emily's story, the memory of her cousin, the way the doctors had missed something so simple, so obvious. She tossed and turned in her bed, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her chest. Was she really about to do this? Was she really about to act? To risk everything for Sophie, a child she barely knew? She thought about what Sophie's life had been like, the isolation, the silence, the constant frustration. It mirrored Emily's, and the thought that she might have the answer was almost too much to bear. Anna lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. She kept picturing Sophie, the way the little girl had winced, the pain flashing across her face every time she touched her ear. Every time Anna had seen it, it gnawed at her, making her feel helpless. But if Anna could do something, anything, to help her. What if I'm wrong? That thought kept coming back, over and over again. What if I hurt her? She closed her eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept racing back to Sophie. At 2 a.m., Anna finally made her decision. She couldn't wait anymore. She had to do something. For Sophie. The moment she decided, her body seemed to wake up in a rush. Anna Watts, the maid, who had never dared cross boundaries in the mansion, was now standing on the precipice of something bigger than herself. She was about to make a choice that could change everything. She could lose everything, her job, her reputation, even her freedom. But for once in her life, she didn't care. The first light of dawn barely touched the window when Anna rose. She didn't need any fancy tools or medical knowledge, she just needed the courage to follow her instincts. And right now, her instincts were telling her she could help Sophie. The next morning, while Evan was locked away in his business meeting, unaware of the storm about to unfold in the house, Anna made her move. She crept softly down the hall, her heart thumping in her chest with each step. She reached the playroom, and there she found Sophie, sitting quietly by the window. Sophie's head was turned to the side, her small hands resting in her lap. She was lost in her thoughts as usual. But when Anna entered the room, Sophie looked up. There was that familiar spark of recognition in her eyes, but also the same unspoken question. Who is this woman in my life? Anna knelt down gently in front of Sophie, her heart hammering. She had to be calm. She had to do this right. Anna smiled, trying to make Sophie feel comfortable. Sophie, ever trusting, returned the smile. Anna's hands shook, but she kept them steady as she took a deep breath. She hadn't thought this through. She had no plan beyond this moment. Using sign language, the one thing Anna had learned from YouTube videos, those simple, desperate lessons late at night when she'd felt like she could make a difference, she signed, "Does your ear hurt, Sophie?" Sophie's eyes widened. She looked at Anna's hands, her brows furrowing in confusion, and then, slowly, she nodded. It was small, barely perceptible. But Anna saw it. That was all Anna needed. Sophie knew, and Anna knew too. Sophie had been in pain for far too long. The shaking in Anna's hands wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about Sophie's ear. This was about trust. Sophie's trust in her, the hope that she was about to do something monumental. Anna paused, her eyes flickering around the room. Her pulse was racing, but she couldn't back out now. She grabbed a flashlight from the shelf nearby, steadying her hands as she tried to control her breathing. Her heart thundered in her chest. The tweezers she sterilized with rubbing alcohol felt cold in her fingers, like the weight of the decision she was about to make. If I'm wrong, if something goes wrong. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was for Sophie. Sophie deserved to know what it felt like to hear, to live in a world where she could hear. Anna gently turned Sophie's head toward her, the flashlight illuminating the small, fragile ear. With one steadying breath, Anna bent over, carefully examining Sophie's ear. She could see it now. There it was. The blockage. Not just wax. This was different. The years of neglect, the months of pain, all led to this moment. The small, hardened blockage that had been undetected for far too long. Anna knew it. She could see it in Sophie's face. The discomfort. The pain that had been silently building up. It was there, lodged deep within, an obstruction that could be easily fixed if someone had just looked. Without another second to waste, Anna gently began to maneuver the tweezers, her fingers steady despite the pressure. Her mind raced. Could she really do this? Could she be the one to give Sophie the world she deserved? 20 minutes. That's how long it took. Sophie sat perfectly still, trusting Anna completely, despite the unknown that had now been placed in her hands. Sophie's small face remained expressionless for what felt like an eternity. But then, Anna felt it. It gave. The blockage slid free, gently removed. Anna held her breath, her eyes locked on Sophie. Sophie blinked. Her head tilted slightly as if trying to adjust to the new sound. Then, slowly, Sophie's eyes widened. She turned her head toward Anna, her eyes alight with confusion and wonder. And then, the miracle. "Sophie, can you hear me?" Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. Sophie blinked again, her face lighting up as realization began to spread across her expression. For the first time in her entire life, Sophie could hear. The weight of everything that had been taken from her, everything she had never had, suddenly lifted. Sophie's mouth opened. Her small hands trembled. Tears welled up in her eyes. She whispered, her voice quiet but clear. Yes. It was more than Anna could handle. Tears blurred her vision as she knelt in front of Sophie, unable to believe what had just happened. She had done it. She had done it. Sophie was hearing the world for the first time. Anna wiped her eyes quickly, trying to contain her emotions. She had just given a little girl something she'd never had, a chance at a normal life. But as the weight of the moment settled in, Anna's heart began to race again. What now? What would happen next? She had just changed everything. But at what cost? When Evan came home that evening, he didn't expect to hear anything out of the ordinary. He was still reeling from the conversation with Dr. Reed. his mind spinning with the possibilities, but he couldn't push the moment of his daughter's hearing out of his head. It was supposed to be a miracle. His daughter could finally hear. Sophie, his little girl, was no longer trapped in silence. But something was off. The usual stillness that filled the house felt different tonight. There was a quiet, an energy, like everything was hanging on the edge of something. Evan walked into the mansion and immediately headed for the library, where Sophie usually spent her time. The door was slightly open. He hesitated before pushing it further, a rush of emotions flooding him again. He stepped into the room, and there she was, Sophie, sitting by the large window, sunlight streaming around her like a halo, holding a book in her tiny hands. But it wasn't the way she was sitting that caught his attention. It wasn't the serene atmosphere of the room. It was the sound. Sophie was reading out loud. Her voice was soft, clear, and precise. She was reading words from a book, just like any other child. Evan froze in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. For a long moment he just stood there, completely motionless, listening. Sophie didn't stop reading. She didn't even seem to notice that he was standing there. Sophie? His voice was hoarse, unsure, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. Sophie stopped, slowly turned her head toward him, and smiled. Her eyes were bright, filled with the excitement of hearing her own voice for the first time. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice warm, full of wonder. Evan's world shifted. His legs almost gave out beneath him. His knees buckled as the flood of emotions overwhelmed him. It felt like his heart had stopped beating, then suddenly restarted, pounding in his chest. He had waited for this moment for so long, and now it was happening. Sophie could hear him. His daughter could hear. The world seemed to fade around him. The silence that had once consumed their home was suddenly filled with sound, with her voice. Sophie, who had never heard him before, was speaking. Evan could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he couldn't stop himself. This was the moment he had dreamed of. The miracle that had seemed impossible was now his reality. He staggered toward her, collapsing to his knees in front of her. He staggered toward her, collapsing to his knees in front of her, unable to control the raw emotion flooding through him. Sophie smiled down at him, a smile so bright and innocent, her joy pure. But as Evan reached for her, the questions, the overwhelming flood of confusion finally hit him. He gazed at Sophie, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Sophie, how? How is this possible? How can you hear me now?" Sophie simply smiled again, her eyes wide with joy. She didn't understand the depth of the question, nor the weight of the miracle that had just happened to her. To her, it was just a moment of wonder. She could hear her father's voice. It was that simple. But for Evan, everything had just shifted. He looked at Anna, who was standing quietly across the room, watching them with a mix of awe and hesitation. It was her. She had done this. She had made this possible. Evan's voice wavered. "Anna, what happened? How did this... What did you do?" Anna swallowed hard, looking at the floor before meeting his gaze. She stepped forward slowly, almost reluctantly. I just saw something no one else had," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sophie kept touching her ear, wincing. "It reminded me of something I saw before with my cousin Emily. She had the same problem. The doctors missed it, but my grandmother noticed. I thought it might be a blockage." Evan's heart skipped a beat. "A blockage?" He stood up slowly, his mind spinning. "Wait," he said, his voice low but urgent. "A blockage? A physical obstruction?" Anna nodded, her eyes full of guilt, but also something else, confidence. "Yes, I found it. I removed it. I know I'm not a doctor, Mr. Richmond, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to do something." Evan's body tensed, his chest constricting. He was shaking with the shock of it all. How could she have done this? How had Anna, a maid with no medical background, found what every specialist, every doctor had missed? He looked at Sophie again, his emotions swirling into a chaotic storm. She was smiling, still so unaware of the profound change in her life, the miracle that had been handed to her. She could hear, and it was because of Anna. The years of pain, the guilt of watching Sophie grow up in silence, the frustration of being told nothing could be done, were all now swept away in an instant. But then Anna's face flashed through Evan's mind. Anna Watts, the maid. The woman who had done what no doctor had done. She had seen what the specialists had missed. She had found the blockage in Sophie's ear. She had removed it. She had given him back his daughter. And with that, a dark, unsettling realization began to settle in. If Anna, a woman with no medical training, had found the solution, then why hadn't anyone else? He pulled himself up, his breath ragged, his vision blurry from the tears. He turned to Anna. The calm that had enveloped him moments before evaporated. Evan's emotions shifted from pure joy to something else, something darker. "Wait," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. He looked at Anna, his expression hardening. "You're telling me it was just a blockage? A physical obstruction?" Anna nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced at Sophie, who was still grinning in wonder, completely oblivious to the conversation happening around her. "Yes, sir." Evan's heart rate spiked. His eyes narrowed as the anger began to bubble to the surface. "You mean to tell me," he growled, his voice low, barely contained, "that all this time, for 8 years, millions of dollars, I've had specialists, top-of-the-line doctors from Switzerland, Germany, Japan, all telling me Sophie's deafness was irreversible. And you're telling me they all missed this?" Anna took a small step back, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of Evan's words hit her. Evan's body was tense, his chest rising and falling with each angry breath. The rage wasn't just at the doctors anymore, it was at himself too. He had trusted them. He had spent everything trying to fix Sophie, trying to save her. And now he was looking at a simple blockage, something anyone could have found, something that had been there the entire time. The silence in the room was suffocating. Evan's voice went ice cold. "I spent 8 years," he said slowly, enunciating each word, "and millions of dollars. The best specialists in the world examined my daughter. And you're telling me they missed this?" The question hung in the air, the accusation clear in Evan's voice. Anna didn't say a word. Her silence spoke volumes, and the weight of it seemed to crush everything else in the room. Evan stormed over to his desk. His hands shook as he picked up the small object Anna had retrieved from Sophie's ear. He looked down at it for a moment, something so small, so insignificant. But it had taken 8 years. The rage inside him surged. He grabbed his phone and dialed with shaking fingers. 1 hour later. The door opened, and Dr. Harrison Reed, the lead specialist on Sophie's case for 5 years, stepped into the room. His face was pale, his steps slow, almost hesitant. The man who had been trusted to give Evan the answers was now standing before him, looking like a man who had just been called to the principal's office. "Harrison," Evan said coldly, his voice cutting through the silence, "I need you to explain something to me." He slid the small blockage across the desk, toward Dr. Reed. "My maid found this," he said, his voice barely containing his fury, "in my daughter's ear. She can hear now, after you told me repeatedly that it was impossible." Dr. Reed's face was drained of colour. He took a step back, staring at the object. His breath caught in his throat. "Evan, we ran every test, every scan." Dr. Reed started, but Evan wasn't having it. "Did you look in her ear?" Evan interrupted, his tone like ice. "Of course we did. You look!" Evan's voice rose, his anger seeping through every word. Dr. Reed's silence was deafening. That silence was all Evan needed to know. The room felt like it was closing in on him, his hands balled into fists, his knuckles turning white. The rage that had been simmering under the surface for years since Sophie's birth was finally unleashed. But Evan wasn't done yet. He took a step toward Dr. Reed, his voice a low, controlled fury. "I need to know something, Harrison, and I need the truth. Did you miss this, or did you ignore it?" Dr. Reed looked up, his eyes narrowing. A flicker of something. Fear passing through them. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying," Evan said slowly, his words carefully chosen, "that a cured patient stops being a patient. I'm implying that my daughter's irreversible condition has been very, very profitable for a lot of people." Dr. Reed stood up abruptly, his hands moving defensively, almost instinctively. "I won't be accused of—" "Sit down." Evan's voice stopped Dr. Reed dead in his tracks. It was as if the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. The power in Evan's words was undeniable. "I have forensic accountants going through every bill, every procedure, every test you've ever ordered for Sophie. And if I find out you knew, if I find out you kept my daughter deaf for money—" Evan's voice dropped to a whisper. "I will destroy you. I will destroy your practice. I will destroy everyone who was complicit. And I won't stop until the entire system burns." Over the next 72 hours, Evan did something he should have done years ago. He investigated. For so long, he had been buried under the weight of grief, guilt, and the false promises of specialists. He had trusted the system, trusted the doctors, and spent millions in an attempt to fix Sophie. But now, Sophie could hear, she could speak. And the question that had haunted him for 8 years echoed louder than ever. Why didn't anyone else see this? The answer wasn't just hidden in one case. It was woven into a pattern, a web of corruption, negligence, and greed. The deeper Evan dug, the more monstrous the truth became. Evan's team, his own hand-picked investigators, worked around the clock, combing through medical records, internal communications, and financial transactions. What they uncovered went beyond Sophie's case. Much beyond. It wasn't just Sophie's case that had been ignored. It wasn't just her who had been mistreated. Evan's team discovered 47 other children, all diagnosed with the same condition: irreversible hearing loss. Each child had been treated by Dr. Reed's network, the same specialists Evan had trusted, and every single one of those children had been told, just like Sophie, that their hearing loss was beyond repair. Their futures, their voices, stolen. The doctors had told the parents the same lie. There was nothing that could be done. But as Evan pored over the files, the anger bubbled up inside him. They had misdiagnosed all of them. 47 children, the same protocol, the same treatments, the same irreversible diagnosis. Evan's mind raced. The pattern was everywhere. Endless diagnostic tests, tests that led nowhere. No answers, only more bills. Expensive experimental treatments, treatments that promised hope but delivered nothing. Procedures that did nothing, more interventions that drained families' bank accounts with no results. And always, always, the same conclusion: irreversible. But there was something else, something far worse. Evan found internal emails, hidden messages between Dr. Reed and pharmaceutical representatives, notes from medical conferences detailing protocols for extended treatment. The language was clear. It wasn't about helping patients, it was about keeping them in the system, keeping them paying. One email made Evan's blood run cold. He read it over and over again, trying to digest what it said. Richmond case. Continue monitoring. Patient's father has significant resources. Recommend extended treatment protocol. Potential for long-term revenue stream. They knew that Sophie could potentially be helped. They knew that the blockage wasn't a permanent condition. They knew, but they had kept it hidden. Why? Because a cured patient doesn't need $50,000 consultations. A cured patient doesn't need experimental drugs. A cured patient doesn't need quarterly MRIs. They didn't care about Sophie's health. They cared about the money. Sophie wasn't a patient to them. She was just another revenue stream. Evan slammed the file shut, his fists clenched. Rage burned through him, raging against the doctors, the system, the entire medical establishment that had let this happen. He wasn't just angry, he was furious. He had been lied to. He had been used. And now it was time to do something about it. Evan's anger quickly turned into action. He called for a press conference. The moment he walked out on that stage, the world would know what had happened to Sophie. They would know about the doctors who had failed her, about the greed that had kept her silenced for so long. It would be public. It would be uncontested. But just as everything seemed set to fall into place, as Evan prepared to make the ultimate move, something unexpected happened. It was the night before the press conference when the doorbell rang. Evan had barely managed to eat dinner. His thoughts were still consumed with his next steps. How would the world react? Would anyone else come forward with stories of their own children who had been mistreated? Then the knock at the door came, sharp and precise, cutting through the quiet night. Evan didn't expect it. He opened the door to find a man standing on his doorstep, expensive suit, perfectly pressed, and a cold smile that didn't belong in his mansion. This wasn't a friendly visitor. This man had a purpose. "I'm Mr. Simon West, with the Medical Licensing Board," the man introduced himself, his voice formal, almost too formal. "We understand you're upset, Mr. Richmond. But making unsubstantiated accusations against respected physicians could have consequences." Evan stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the man's words hitting him. "Consequences? What are you implying?" Mr. West didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. "It's not an implication, Mr. Richmond, it's advice. Dr. Reed has an impeccable reputation. Your maid, on the other hand, practiced medicine without a license. That's a felony." Evan's blood ran cold. "Felony?" The words hung in the air like poison. "So you're telling me," Evan growled, taking a step forward, his fists clenched, "if I go public with this, you'll go after Anna?" The man didn't flinch. His smile remained, but it was more calculating now. "We're simply pointing out that unlicensed medical practice is a serious crime, Mr. Richmond, one that carries prison time. It would be most unfortunate if the woman who helped your daughter ended up behind bars." The words landed like a punch. Anna, the one who had saved Sophie, the woman who had seen what no one else had, who had been the difference between life and silence for Sophie, was now the one at risk. Evan's jaw clenched. His world suddenly felt like it was closing in around him. This wasn't just a fight with doctors anymore, it was a fight with the entire system. The man turned to leave, his smile widening ever so slightly. "We'll be watching closely, Mr. Richmond. This is a serious matter." He stepped into his car, and the engine roared to life, the sound fading into the night. Evan stood there, his mind racing, his body trembling with the weight of the decision now resting heavily on his shoulders. The press conference would happen tomorrow. The truth would come out. But now the stakes had changed. Anna was caught in the crossfire. Her future was now in Evan's hands. And in the silence of his mansion, surrounded by the memories of everything Sophie had suffered, Evan realized one thing. He couldn't stop now. That night, Evan sat in his office, the room bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp. The darkness outside seemed to press in against the walls of the mansion. His fingers drummed anxiously on the desk, but his mind wasn't on the numbers or deals that usually filled his thoughts. Tonight, his mind was consumed with something far more important, something that had shaken him to his core. On one side of the desk lay a stack of evidence. Documents, internal emails, receipts, test results, proof that the medical system had failed Sophie. Proof that they had failed 47 other children. Evidence that could expose a corrupt system of negligence and greed. On the other side was Anna, the woman who had given Sophie the one thing that no doctor had been able to, the one thing he had desperately tried to give her for 8 years. Sophie's voice, the sound of her laughter, her words, her world finally opened up. Anna had saved his daughter. But if he moved forward, If he exposed the truth, Anna would face serious consequences. The system wouldn't just take Sophie's healing from her, they would come after Anna. The weight of the decision felt like a crushing force pressing down on his chest. His fingers clenched into fists, the raging storm inside him reflecting in the papers before him. He wanted to fight. He wanted to bring down the system, to make sure no other child would suffer the way Sophie had. But how could he destroy the very woman who had brought his daughter back to life? The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like hours. And then the door opened. Sophie walked in, her small figure standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, the innocence of childhood still gleaming there, but there was something more, something perceptive in her gaze. She had been listening. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice still a little tentative, still unfamiliar but beautiful in its newfound clarity. "What are you going to do?" Evan looked at her, his heart sinking. She was so young, so innocent, and yet here she was, already asking questions that weighed more than her small shoulders should have to bear. His breath caught in his throat. She was his world, his entire reason for fighting. He had spent 8 years doing everything he could to find a solution, to fix the unfixable, to make her world one of sound and life. But now, the very thing that had healed her could also destroy the one person who had given her that gift. "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty that gnawed at him. Sophie walked over to him, standing in front of the desk, her small feet barely making a sound as she stood there, looking up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. "Anna saved me." Evan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. The words stung more than he had anticipated. Anna had saved her, and Sophie was right. She had. "I know," Evan said, his voice thick. "I know she did." Sophie's face grew serious, and she crossed her arms in that way she did when she was thinking hard about something. "And those other kids, they're still deaf, because of the doctors." Evan felt a sharp pain in his chest. The other kids. His mind flashed to the 47 others, all of them, just like Sophie, all misdiagnosed. Children who had suffered for so long because the people who were supposed to help them had looked the other way. And here was Sophie, her voice finally free, asking him to fix what had been broken, to help the others. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the ache in his heart. He wanted to make the right choice. He wanted to help them. But could he risk everything? Could he risk Anna? He had to expose everything. He had to tear down the system that had failed Sophie and 47 other children for nothing more than profit. But the hardest part was just beginning. The fight wasn't over. It had just started. And it was going to cost him everything. The next morning, Evan Richmond didn't just cancel the press conference. He expanded it. He wasn't going to just make a statement. He wasn't going to sit back and let this system get away with what it had done to his daughter, to Sophie, to those 47 other children. Evan hired the best lawyers money could buy, but not for himself, for Anna. He knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Exposing a network of medical corruption was going to make enemies, powerful enemies. He'd seen firsthand the lengths the system would go to protect itself. But Anna had made the difference. She had saved Sophie. And she was now at the center of this war, whether she realized it or not. And then Evan made one more call, a call that would change everything. He dialed the numbers of the 47 families, the ones who had been misdiagnosed, the ones who had been told there was no hope for their children. One by one, he spoke to them, each conversation more heartbreaking than the last. He explained what had happened to Sophie, what Anna had done, and what they were going to do about it. But it wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It was about justice. For every child who had been ignored, dismissed, and failed. Evan promised them that together they would expose the truth. Together They would dismantle the system that had turned their children's pain into profit. The press conference was packed. There were reporters, cameras flashing from every angle. The room buzzed with anticipation but also suspicion. The medical community was already on edge. They didn't know what Evan was about to say, but they could feel the weight of what was coming. Dr. Reed's lawyers were already present, sitting in the front row, their eyes carefully trained on Evan. The tension in the room was palpable. Evan walked up to the podium, his jaw tight with determination, his shoulders squared. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. He wasn't just speaking for Sophie anymore. He was speaking for every child who had been silenced, for every family who had been told that their child's condition was beyond hope. He cleared his throat, and the room fell into a heavy silence. 8 years ago, Evan began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his words, my daughter was born deaf. I was told nothing could be done. I believed the experts. I believed them because, well, they were the experts. They had the degrees, the titles, the experience. They told me it was irreversible, and I trusted them. For 8 years, I trusted them. Evan paused. His gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of those in attendance. He could feel their judgment, their doubt, but he also felt the power in his words. He wasn't just talking about Sophie now. He was talking about all the families, every single person who had been lied to. And then he dropped the bombshell. 3 weeks ago, my maid, a woman with no medical degree, cured my daughter in 20 minutes. The room erupted in disbelief. A maid? A woman with no formal medical training? A cure in 20 minutes? It didn't make sense. How could it? But Evan didn't flinch. He let the words sink in. He let them digest. The world had been blind, and now they had to see the truth. Today I'm announcing a $500 million fund, Evan continued, his voice growing in strength. A fund to investigate medical negligence in childhood deafness cases, to provide free second opinions, to protect whistleblowers like Anna Watts from retaliation. The room went silent, the air thick with shock. A fund. $500 million to expose the corruption, to give families the resources they needed to fight back. It wasn't just about making a statement, it was about building something that would stand. Something that would force the system to listen. And Evan wasn't done yet. I'm also filing a class action lawsuit against Dr. Harrison Reed and 17 associated practices. The evidence is overwhelming, and I won't stop until every child who was failed by this system gets justice. The reporters went wild. Cameras flashed. Questions were thrown at him from every direction, but Evan kept his gaze steady. He didn't allow himself to be distracted. This wasn't just about the headlines, it was about exposing the people who had taken advantage of families like his. It was about retribution. The lawyers for Dr. Reed scrambled, trying to gather their composure, but it was clear Evan's move had sent shockwaves through the room. The medical community was under threat, and they knew it. As the chaos unfolded, Evan turned slightly, his eyes scanning the back of the room. There, standing quietly, was Anna, her face pale, her expression a mix of relief and fear. She hadn't asked for any of this, she had just wanted to help. Tears streamed down Anna's face as she stood there, watching the billionaire take on the very system that had failed her, and Sophie. Anna had never imagined that her small act of kindness could lead to something like this. But here it was. She watched as Evan, a man who had everything, went to war for 47 children. For Sophie. Because one maid decided to care. The room was still buzzing. The press had enough to report on for days. But Evan didn't care. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about his empire. This was about doing the right thing, and nothing was going to stop him. 6 months later. The world had changed for Evan Richmond, and it was about to change for so many others. Dr. Harrison Reed, the man who had promised the impossible, the man who had told Evan that nothing could be done for Sophie, was no longer a respected physician. His medical license had been revoked, the criminal charges piling up as his actions were finally brought to light. It wasn't just his career that was over, his reputation was shattered, and the lives he had ruined were slowly being repaired, one by one. But Dr. Reed wasn't alone. 12 other doctors, specialists, well-respected figures in the medical community were now under investigation. Their involvement in the systemic neglect of children, their participation in covering up treatments that could have helped, was being exposed. The veil of medical corruption was being pulled back, and the truth was pouring out. And as for the 47 children that Evans' team had identified, the results were staggering. 31 of them had treatable conditions that had been missed, ignored, or misdiagnosed. 31 children who had been told they would never hear. 31 children who now had their hearing back. Evans stood on the steps of his mansion, staring out at the world that was slowly coming into focus. The house felt different now, less like a place of loneliness, and more like a home again. Sophie's laughter filled the halls, her voice ringing through the rooms like a song that had been absent for too long. And through all the chaos, the lawsuits, the press conferences, the investigation, there was one thing that Evan was sure of. He had changed things, not just for Sophie, for all the children who had been robbed of their future. And as for Anna Watts, the woman who had done what no one else could, the one who had saved Sophie and ignited the chain of events that would unravel the medical system's greed, she didn't go to prison. Instead, Evan gave her the opportunity of a lifetime. He funded her education, a full ride to medical school. At first, Anna hadn't known how to respond. She hadn't expected anything. She had only acted out of compassion, instinct, and a desire to help. But Evan saw something in her, something powerful. She was intelligent, caring, and driven by a desire to help children like Sophie. Anna graduated top of her class, her name becoming synonymous with integrity, bravery, and change. Her journey wasn't easy. She faced scrutiny, doubt, and criticism from every corner of the medical community. But she fought through it. She learned, she grew, and she became a doctor, one who was not only skilled, but also deeply attuned to the humanity of her patients. Today, Dr. Anna Watts ran the Richmond Foundation for Medical Oversight, a non-profit organization dedicated to medical transparency, accountability, and compassionate care for children. Through the foundation, Anna had saved hundreds of children, just like Sophie, children who had been misdiagnosed, neglected, or misunderstood. She wasn't just a doctor. She was a beacon of hope for families who had been let down by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Sophie was now 16. She was a straight-A student, a young woman with dreams bigger than Evan could have ever imagined. The joy she had once found in hearing the world around her now translated into an unrelenting drive to help others. She wanted to be a doctor, just like Dr. Anna Watts, the woman who had given her the world back. Sophie stood tall, confident, and eager to face the future. But she never forgot where she had come from. She knew the power of compassion, the importance of truly seeing the people around you, of looking beyond the labels, beyond the diagnoses, and seeing them as more than just patients. Sophie had become a spokesperson for the foundation, speaking at schools, events, and conferences, telling her story to the world. Every time she spoke, there was a fire in her words, a passion for justice, for truth, and for the children whose voices had been stifled by the system. She always ended her speeches with the same line, her voice clear, confident, and filled with meaning. Sometimes, the people who save you aren't the ones with the degrees. They're the ones who care enough to look. Evan watched her speak at a recent charity event. His chest swelled with pride. He had spent his life building empires. But this was the legacy that mattered. Sophie's future, Anna's work, the hundreds of children who had now found a voice, who had been given a chance at a life they had been denied. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about power. It was about making a difference. And as Evan sat in the back of the room listening to Sophie speak, he knew that the fight had been worth it. Every bit of it. His daughter could hear, she could speak, she could change the world. And so could Anna. This story asks us an uncomfortable question. How many other Sophies are out there? How many children are suffering because the system values profit over patience? Anna Watts wasn't a hero because she had expertise. She was a hero because she had courage. The courage to question experts. The courage to act when everyone else walked past. The courage to risk everything for a child who wasn't even hers. What would you have done? Would you have stayed in your lane? Or would you have grabbed those tweezers? Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. And if this story moved you, share it. Because somewhere out there, there might be another Sophie, another family drowning in silence. And they need to know that sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places.